The morning dawned with a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I opened my eyes, momentarily confused by the unusual silence in our typically bustling home. Then, like a tidal wave, the reality of the day ahead crashed over me. Today was the day I'd have to say goodbye to my son, Tommy. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, willing time to stop. The soft tick of the clock on the nightstand felt like a countdown to the moment I'd been dreading since that awful night 3 days ago. A car accident. A drunk driver. A life cut tragically short. The unfairness of it all made my chest tighten with a pain I couldn't even begin to describe. Finally, I mustered the strength to swing my legs over the side of the bed. My wife, Sarah, was already up. I could hear her moving around downstairs, probably making coffee we wouldn't taste and food we wouldn't eat. It was just something to do, I suppose, a way to keep her hands busy while her heart was breaking. I shuffled to the bathroom, each step feeling like I was wading through molasses. The face that stared back at me from the mirror was a stranger's, hollow-eyed, pale, with a 3-day stubble I couldn't bring myself to care about. I splashed some cold water on my face, hoping it might shock me out of this nightmare. But when I looked up again, nothing had changed. This was our new reality. Dressing for a funeral is a surreal experience, especially when it's for your own child. I pulled out the dark suit I'd worn to my father's funeral just last year. Who would have thought I'd be wearing it again so soon, and for such an unthinkable reason? My hands shook as I did up the buttons of my shirt, fumbling with the tie until I gave up and left it hanging loose around my neck. As I made my way downstairs, the silence was broken by a muffled sob. I found Sarah in the kitchen, clutching Tommy's favorite mug, a chipped Star Wars one he'd refused to part with since he was 10. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. Without a word, I wrapped my arms around her, and we stood there, drawing strength from each other's presence. The doorbell rang, startling us both. It was my sister, Kate, arriving early to help with any last-minute arrangements. She hugged us tightly, murmuring words of comfort that washed over me without really sinking in. Kate had always been the practical one, and today was no different. She gently steered Sarah upstairs to finish getting ready while I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee she'd placed in front of me. As the morning wore on, our house began to fill with family and close friends. Their hushed voices and sympathetic glances created a cocoon of shared grief around us. My parents arrived, looking older than I'd ever seen them. Mom immediately went to Sarah, enveloping her in a tearful embrace, while Dad squeezed my shoulder, his usual stoicism cracking to reveal the pain underneath. The ride to the church was a blur. I sat in the back of the sleek black car, sandwiched between Sarah and Kate, feeling like I was watching everything happen from a great distance. The streets we'd driven down countless times now seemed alien and unwelcoming. We passed the park where I'd taught Tommy to ride a bike, the ice cream shop where we'd celebrated every report card, the high school where he'd just started his senior year. Each familiar sight was a reminder of all the moments we'd shared, and all the future moments we'd never have. The church loomed before us, its stone facade oddly comforting in its solidity. As we stepped out of the car, I felt Sarah's hand slip into mine, gripping it tightly. We walked up the steps together, our footsteps echoing in the hushed quiet that had fallen over the gathered mourners. Inside, the church was filled with flowers, roses, lilies, and Tommy's favorite sunflowers. Their sweet scent hung heavy in the air, almost overwhelming. At the front stood the casket, polished wood gleaming under the soft lights. My steps faltered as we approached it. How could my vibrant, laughing boy be in there? It seemed impossible. As we took our seats in the front pew, I looked around at the sea of faces behind us. Tommy's friends from the soccer team, still in shock, their usual boisterous energy replaced by stunned silence. His teachers, looking lost without their star student. Neighbors, coworkers, distant relatives, all here to say goodbye to a life that had touched so many. The service began, a blur of hymns and readings. The pastor spoke of Tommy's kindness, his infectious laugh, his passion for life. Each word was true, yet somehow inadequate to capture the essence of our son. How could anyone sum up 17 years of love, hopes, and dreams in a few short minutes? When it came time for the eulogy, I stood on shaky legs and made my way to the pulpit. I'd stayed up most of the night writing and rewriting what I wanted to say, but now, facing the congregation, all those carefully chosen words fled my mind. Instead, I spoke from the heart, sharing memories of Tommy that made people smile through their tears, his terrible jokes, his fierce loyalty to his friends, the way he'd light up talking about his latest coding project. As I spoke, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The heavy blanket of sorrow lifted slightly, replaced by a bittersweet warmth as we all remembered the joy Tommy had brought into our lives. It wasn't enough to fill the void left by his absence, but it was a reminder that his impact would live on in all of us. After the service, we made our way to the cemetery. The sun had come out, casting a golden glow over the peaceful grounds. As we gathered around the gravesite, the finality of the moment hit me with full force. This was it. The last time we'd all be together with Tommy. The pastor's words washed over me as the casket was lowered into the ground. I felt Sarah trembling beside me and pulled her close. Kate stood on my other side, her hand on my back, a silent pillar of support. As handfuls of earth were scattered over the casket, I closed my eyes, remembering Tommy's laugh, the feel of his hand in mine when he was little, the pride in his eyes when he showed me his latest computer program. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring condolences as they passed. Soon, only our immediate family remained. We stood there, united in our grief, each lost in our own memories. As the workers began to fill in the grave, Dad gently suggested we head back to the house. But I couldn't move. The thought of leaving Tommy here alone was unbearable. Sarah seemed to sense my struggle. Just a few more minutes, she whispered to the others. They nodded in understanding and slowly made their way back to the cars, leaving us alone with our son. We stood there, hand in hand, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tommy would have loved this view. He always had an eye for beauty in the world around him. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. Tommy might be gone from this world, but he would always be a part of us. With a deep breath, I turned to Sarah. "Let's go home," I said softly. She nodded, wiping away a tear. As we walked away, I glanced back one last time. "Goodbye, son," I whispered. "We love you." The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As we pulled up to the house, I noticed cars lining the street. Of course, the reception. In the emotional turmoil of the day, I'd completely forgotten about it. The thought of facing a house full of people, of having to be strong and gracious in our grief, was almost too much to bear. But as we walked through the door, the atmosphere wasn't what I expected. Instead of hushed conversations and pitying looks, we were greeted by the gentle hum of shared stories and even the occasional chuckle. In the living room, Tommy's friends had set up a slideshow of photos, and people were gathered around, smiling at images of Tommy throughout his life. In the kitchen, neighbors had filled every available surface with food, casseroles, salads, and Tommy's favorite chocolate chip cookies. The smell of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air, somehow making our house feel like home again, even in the midst of our loss. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn into conversations, sharing memories of Tommy and listening to others do the same. It wasn't the somber, oppressive event I dreaded. Instead, it felt like a celebration of Tommy's life, exactly what he would have wanted. Later, as the last guests were leaving, Kate pulled me aside. "I have something for you," she said, pressing a small USB drive into my hand. "Tommy's friends put this together. It's a collection of videos and messages from everyone. They thought you might like to have it." I clutched the drive tightly, overcome with emotion. It was a tangible piece of Tommy's impact on the world, a reminder of all the lives he touched in his short time with us. That night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet once more, Sarah and I sat on the couch, physically and emotionally exhausted. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The day had been a roller coaster of emotions, but we'd gotten through it together. As I drifted off to sleep, my last thought was of Tommy. In my mind's eye, I saw him not as he was in the casket, but as he had been in life, laughing, full of energy and dreams. And for the first time since we'd lost him, I felt a glimmer of hope. We would never stop missing him, but we would find a way to carry on, to live in a way that would make him proud. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but we would walk it together, carrying Tommy's memory with us every step of the way. The days following Tommy's funeral passed in a haze of grief and exhaustion. Sarah and I moved through our daily routines like ghosts, going through the motions without really engaging with the world around us. The house felt emptier than ever, Tommy's absence a constant, aching void that nothing could fill. It was about a week after the funeral when my sister Kate called. I answered the phone mechanically, expecting another well-meaning check-in or offer of help. But the conversation that followed left me reeling, anger, and disbelief warring for dominance in my mind. "Hey, John," Kate's voice came through, unnaturally cheerful. "How are you holding up?" I mumbled something noncommittal, not really in the mood for small talk. But Kate pressed on, her tone becoming more animated. "Listen, I've been thinking," she said, a note of excitement creeping into her voice. "We all need something to lift our spirits, you know? So I've decided to throw a big family party next month. It'll be great, the whole clan together, lots of food, music, maybe even some games. What do you think?" For a moment, I thought I must have misheard her. A party? Now? The idea was so wildly inappropriate that I couldn't even formulate a response. Kate, apparently taking my silence for consideration, barreled on. "I've already talked to Mom and Dad, and they think it's a fantastic idea. They're even offering to help with the costs. We could have it at your place, you know, since you have the biggest house and that lovely backyard." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Not only was Kate suggesting a celebration mere weeks after we'd buried my son, but she wanted to have it in our home, the very place where every corner, every object held memories of Tommy. "Kate," I finally managed to say, my voice strained. "I don't think Dash," but she cut me off, her enthusiasm seemingly blind to my distress. "Oh, come on, John. I know you're going through a tough time, but that's exactly why we need this. It'll be good for everyone, especially you and Sarah. You need to get out of that funk, start living again." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. A funk? Is that what she thought this was? As if losing a child was something you just snapped out of with a bit of music and some party games? "Kate, listen to me," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "We're not ready for a party. It's too soon." "Tommy's only been gone 4 I know, she interrupted again, her tone softening slightly. "But life goes on, John. We can't just stop living because of tragedy. Tommy wouldn't have wanted that." The mention of Tommy's name in this context sent a surge of anger through me. How dare she presume to know what Tommy would have wanted? How could she possibly understand what we were going through? "I'm sorry, Kate," I said, my voice now cold and firm. "But the answer is no. We won't be hosting any parties. Not now, not next month, not anytime soon. I have to go." I hung up before she could respond, my hand shaking as I set the phone down. The silence in the house suddenly felt oppressive, and I found myself gasping for air. I stumbled out to the backyard, collapsing onto the old wooden bench where Tommy and I used to sit and talk. As I sat there, trying to process what had just happened, I heard the back door open. Sarah stepped out, concern etched on her face. "John? What's wrong?" "I heard you on the phone." I looked up at her, seeing the worry in her eyes, and felt a fresh wave of pain wash over me. How could I tell her about this? How could I explain that while we were drowning in grief, my own sister was planning a celebration? But as Sarah sat beside me, taking my hand, in hers, I knew I had to tell her. Our shared loss had brought us closer than ever before, and I couldn't keep this from her. So I told her everything. Kate's call, her ridiculous party idea, her insistence that we needed to get out of our funk. As I spoke, I watched Sarah's expression change from concern to disbelief, and finally to a quiet anger that mirrored my own. "I can't believe she would even suggest such a thing," Sarah said when I finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "And your parents, they agreed to this?" I nodded, feeling a renewed sense of betrayal. Apparently, they think it's a fantastic idea, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the treehouse Tommy and I had built together when he was 10. It stood empty now, a poignant reminder of happier times. "What are we going to do?" she finally asked, turning back to me. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know. I told Kate no, but you know how she is. She's not likely to let this go easily." As if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a string of messages from Kate, alternating between guilt-tripping and cajoling. I showed them to Sarah, who read them with a growing look of frustration. "She just doesn't get it, does she?" Sarah said, handing the phone back to me. "It's like she's living in a completely different reality." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of anger and sadness. Kate and I had always been close, but this felt like a betrayal of everything we'd been through together. "Maybe we should talk to your parents," Sarah suggested after a while. "If they understand how we feel about this, maybe they can talk some sense into Kate." It was a reasonable suggestion, but something in me rebelled against the idea. Why should we have to explain ourselves? Why couldn't our family just respect our grief, our need for time and space to heal? But I knew Sarah was right. If we didn't address this head-on, it would only fester, creating a rift in the family at a time when we needed each other most. So that evening, we drove over to my parents' house. The familiar street, lined with old maple trees just starting to turn color, felt different now. Every house we passed held memories of Tommy, riding his bike, playing with neighborhood kids, walking home from school. It was like navigating through a minefield of memories. When we arrived, my mother opened the door, her face lighting up at the sight of us. "John, Sarah. What a lovely surprise. Come in, come in." We followed her into the living room, where my father was watching a baseball game. He muted the TV as we entered, a smile on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. They both looked older, I realized with a pang. Tommy's death had affected them deeply too, though perhaps not in the same way it had shattered our world. "So, what brings you two over?" Mom asked as we settled onto the couch. "Can I get you anything?" "I just made some fresh lemonade." I shook my head, steeling myself for the conversation ahead. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk about this party Kate's planning." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Mom's smile faltered, and Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Oh," Mom said, her voice small. "Kate mentioned she'd talk to you about it." "Talked isn't exactly the word I'd use," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. More like steamrolled over any objections I might have had. Dad leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Now, John, I know it might seem a bit soon, but Kate's heart is in the right place. She just wants to bring the family together, help everyone start healing." I felt Sarah tense beside me, and I squeezed her hand gently. "Dad, Mom, I understand that Kate means well, but you have to see how inappropriate this is. It's barely been a month since we buried Tommy. We're not ready for a celebration, especially not in our home." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart, we didn't mean to upset you. We just thought, we thought it might help. Give you something to look forward to." Her words, well-intentioned as they were, sparked a fresh wave of anger in me. "Look forward to? Mom, our son is dead. Do you really think a party is going to fix that? That we can just decide to be happy again because Kate thinks we should be?" The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Sarah spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "We know everyone is trying to help, and we appreciate that. But what we need right now is time and space to grieve. Not a party, not forced cheerfulness, just understanding." Dad nodded slowly, a look of realization dawning on his face. "We've been insensitive, haven't we? I'm sorry, son. Sarah, we should have thought about how this would affect you." Mom reached out, taking my free hand in hers. "We'll talk to Kate," she promised. "Make her understand. The party won't happen, not unless you want it to, and certainly not at your house." I felt some of the tension leave my body at their words. It wasn't a complete resolution. Kate was still likely to be upset, but it was a start. As we drove home that night, Sarah and I talked about how surreal the whole situation felt. Here we were, dealing with the greatest loss of our lives, and somehow we had to navigate other people's expectations and ideas about how we should grieve. It's like they're all living in a different world, Sarah said softly, gazing out the car window. A world where you can just decide to move on, to be okay. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The gulf between those who had experienced this kind of loss and those who hadn't seemed insurmountable at times. When we got home, the house was dark and quiet. As we walked in, I noticed a framed photo of Tommy on the entryway table. It was from his last birthday, his smile wide and carefree. For a moment, the pain of his absence hit me with renewed force. But as Sarah came up beside me, wrapping her arm around my waist, I felt a small measure of peace. We were in this together, navigating this new, unwelcome reality day by day. And for now, that had to be enough. As we got ready for bed that night, I thought about the day's events. The anger I'd felt at Kate's suggestion had faded somewhat, replaced by a weary sort of resignation. I knew she meant well, in her own misguided way. But the incident had highlighted just how long and difficult the road ahead would be, not just in dealing with our own grief, but in helping others understand it too. Sarah and I lay in bed, the room bathed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. "Do you think it'll ever get easier?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." As we drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking of Tommy. In my mind's eye, I saw him laughing, full of life and joy. And for the first time in weeks, the memory brought a smile to my face instead of just pain. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days following our conversation with my parents were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your thoughts echo louder in your head. Sarah and I went through the motions of daily life, but everything felt hollow, meaningless. The world kept turning, oblivious to our pain, and that realization stung more than I cared to admit. It was on a Wednesday afternoon when the fragile peace we'd managed to construct shattered. I was in Tommy's room, finally finding the courage to start sorting through his things when my phone buzzed. A text from Kate. My stomach clenched as I opened it, dreading what I might find. "Hey bro, just wanted to give you a heads up, party's on for next month. Mom and Dad are on board. It'll be great, you'll see. Love you." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring as anger welled up inside me. They were going ahead with it. Despite our objections, despite everything we'd said, they were pushing forward with this ridiculous celebration. In that moment, something inside me snapped. The grief that had been weighing me down transformed into a burning rage. How dare they? How could they be so callous, so blind to our pain? I found myself pacing Tommy's room, my mind racing. This wasn't just about the party anymore. It was about respect, about acknowledging the depth of our loss. It was about making them understand, truly understand, what we were going through. As I moved around the room, my eyes fell on Tommy's computer. He'd been so proud of it, saving up for months to buy the parts and build it himself. An idea began to form in my mind. Tommy had been quite the programmer, always talking about ethical hacking and the power of technology to make a point. I sat down at his desk, powering up the computer. The familiar hum as it came to life felt like Tommy was there with me, guiding my hands. I opened his files, scrolling through lines of code I barely understood. But I didn't need to understand it all. I just needed to find the right pieces. Hours passed as I delved deeper into Tommy's digital world. Sarah checked on me a few times, but seemed to sense I needed space. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, I finally leaned back in the chair, a grim smile on my face. I had the beginnings of a plan. The next few days were a blur of activity. I threw myself into research, learning everything I could about home automation systems, security cameras, and smart devices. Our house, which had once been a source of pride with its high-tech gadgets, now became my playground, my weapon. Sarah noticed the change in me. At first, she seemed relieved to see me engaged in something, anything. But as the days wore on and I spent more and more time hunched over Tommy's computer or tinkering with our home systems, her concern grew. "John," she said one evening, sitting beside me on the couch where I was working on my laptop. "What's going on? You've barely slept, barely eaten. I'm worried about you." I looked up at her, seeing the lines of exhaustion and worry etched on her face. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. In my obsession with making things right, had I been neglecting her? "I'm sorry," I said, closing the laptop. I need to do something, Sarah. I can't sit by and let them steamroll over us like this." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What are you planning, John?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Sarah had always been the more level-headed one, the voice of reason. Would she understand? Or would she try to talk me out of it? "They're still going ahead with the party," I finally said, watching her face carefully. "Kate texted me. They're planning to have it here, in our home, whether we want it or not." Sarah's expression hardened, a flash of anger in her eyes. "They can't do that. This is our house, our space. They have no right." Her reaction emboldened me. "Exactly. And that's why we need to do something. We need to make them understand, to feel what we're feeling." "What are you suggesting?" Sarah asked, her voice low. I took a deep breath. "I'm going to use our home against them. All those smart devices, the security system, the lights, the sound system, I'm going to turn it all into a reminder of what they're trying to ignore, of who they're trying to forget." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond me. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you really think this will help? That it will make them understand?" I reached out, taking her hand in mine. "I don't know, but I know I can't sit by and do nothing. This feels right. Like something Tommy would have done." At the mention of Tommy's name, Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed my hand tightly. "Okay," she said. "Okay, but promise me you won't go too far. We're hurt, John, but we don't want to hurt them back." "Not really." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and resolve. "I promise. This isn't about hurting anyone. It's about making them see, making them feel what we're feeling." With Sarah's tacit approval, I threw myself back into my work with renewed vigor. The plan began to take shape, growing more complex and intricate with each passing day. I set up hidden speakers throughout the house, programmed the lights to flicker and dim at specific times, and rigged the security cameras to display ghostly images on the monitors. But the centerpiece of my plan was Tommy's room. I couldn't bear the thought of partygoers traipsing through his personal space, treating it like just another room in the house. So I turned it into a sanctuary, a memorial that would be impossible to ignore. I programmed the door to lock and unlock at random intervals. Inside, I set up a projection system that would display home videos and photos of Tommy on the walls. The room would be filled with his voice, his laughter, his presence in a way that would be impossible to dismiss. As the day of the party drew nearer, I found myself growing more and more anxious. Doubt began to creep in. Was I going too far? Would this really make them understand, or would it just drive a deeper wedge between us and the rest of the family? Sarah sensed my turmoil. One night, as we lay in bed, she turned to me, her eyes searching my face. In the darkness, "Are you sure about this, John? It's not too late to call it off, to talk to them again." I sighed, staring up at the ceiling. "I don't know, Sarah. I don't know if I'm sure about anything anymore. But I do know that I can't stand the thought of them coming here, celebrating as if nothing has changed, as if Tommy never existed." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then she reached out, intertwining her fingers with mine. "Then we do this together. Whatever happens, we face it as a team." Her words gave me strength, reaffirming my resolve. As I drifted off to sleep that night, my mind was filled with images of Tommy. In my dreams, he was smiling, giving me a thumbs up. It felt like approval, like he was with me in this. The morning of the party dawned bright and clear, a beautiful day that seemed to mock the turmoil inside me. Sarah and I moved through the house, making final preparations. We hadn't responded to any of Kate's messages about the party, letting her assume we'd acquiesce to her plans. As the appointed hour drew near, we retreated to our bedroom, the one room I'd left untouched by my modifications. From here, we could monitor everything through the security camera feeds I'd set up on our TV. The first guests began to arrive, their chatter and laughter floating up to us. I watched on the screen as Kate bustled about, greeting people, directing them to the backyard where tables and decorations had been set up. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, her hand finding mine. I took a deep breath, my finger hovering over the button on my laptop that would set everything in motion. As ready as I'll ever be. With a single click, our plan was set into motion. On the screens, we watched as the lights in the living room began to flicker. The music playing from the speakers in the backyard distorted, Tommy's laughter interspersed with the cheerful tunes. Confusion spread across the faces of the guests. Kate looked around, bewildered, trying to figure out what was happening. And then, as if on cue, the door to Tommy's room swung open. The projections I'd set up came to life, filling the hallway with images of Tommy. His voice echoed through the house, a recording from his last birthday. "I love you, Mom and Dad. You're the best parents anyone could ask for." On the screens, we watched as the party guests fell silent, their faces a mix of shock, confusion, and dawning realization. Kate stood in the middle of it all, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. As Tommy's presence filled the house, making it impossible for anyone to ignore the reason for our grief, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness wash over me. This was it. This was the moment of truth. Would they finally understand? Or had I just driven an irreparable wedge between us and our family? Sarah's hand tightened in mine as we watched the scene unfold. Whatever happened next, we would face it together. And somewhere, I hoped, Tommy was watching too, knowing that he would never be forgotten, never be pushed aside for the sake of moving on. The seed of revenge had blossomed, but whether it would bear fruit or poison remained to be seen. As we watched the chaos unfold on the security monitors, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. There was a grim satisfaction in seeing the shocked faces of our family and friends, but also a twinge of guilt. Had I gone too far? Was this really the right way to make them understand? Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes fixed on the screen. "John," she whispered, "look at Kate." I focused on my sister, watching as she stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her face a mask of shock and dawning realization. The cheerful party decorations seemed garish now, completely at odds with the somber atmosphere that had descended on the gathering. On the screens, we could see guests murmuring to each other, some looking around in confusion, others with tears in their eyes. The images of Tommy projected on the wall seemed to watch over them all, a silent reminder of why this celebration was so misplaced. "Maybe we should go down there," Sarah suggested, her voice uncertain. "Explain what's happening." I hesitated, torn between the desire to see the full impact of my plan and the need to face the consequences of my actions. Before I could decide, there was a knock at our bedroom door. "John? Sarah? Are you in there?" It was my mother's voice, trembling slightly. "Please, we need to talk." Sarah looked at me, a question in her eyes. I nodded, taking a deep breath to steel myself. It was time to face the music. As we opened the door, we found not just my mother, but also my father and Kate. Their faces were a mix of confusion, hurt, and something else, understanding, perhaps? "What's going on, son?" my father asked, his voice gruff with emotion. Did you do all this?" I straightened my shoulders, meeting his gaze. "Yes, I did. You all needed to understand. You needed to feel what we're feeling every day in this house." Kate stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "John, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I thought the party would help. Help." The word came out harsher than I intended. How could a party possibly help? "Tommy is gone, Kate. Our son is dead, and you wanted to celebrate in the very house where he grew up, where every corner holds a memory of him." My mother reached out, her hand trembling as she touched my arm. "We didn't understand, John. We thought we were doing the right thing, trying to bring some joy back into your lives." "Joy?" Sarah spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "We're not ready for joy. We're barely managing to get through each day. How could you think we'd be ready to host a party?" The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint sound of Tommy's laughter echoing from downstairs. It was a recording from his last birthday, the sound both heartbreakingly familiar and painfully distant. My father cleared his throat. "Son, I think it's time we all had a talk. A real talk. Can we go downstairs?" I nodded, feeling suddenly drained. As we made our way down to the living room, I used the remote control in my pocket to turn off the projections and sound system. The abrupt silence was jarring. The guests looked up as we entered, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. I could see the questions in their eyes, the desire to understand what had just happened. "Everyone," my father addressed the room, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd always possessed. "I think it's best if we call it a day. We appreciate you all coming, but there's been a misunderstanding." There were murmurs of assent, and people began to gather their things. As they filed out, many stopped to offer quiet words of support or gentle hugs. I stood there, feeling oddly detached from it all, as if I were watching the scene unfold from a great distance. Once the last guest had left, we gathered in the living room. The leftover party decorations seemed sad and out of place now, a stark reminder of the celebration that wasn't meant to be. "John," Kate began, her voice small, "can you tell us what all this was about?" The lights, the sounds, the images of Tommy. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "It was about making you understand. You all seemed so eager to move on, to get back to normal. But there is no normal for us anymore. Every day, we wake up in this house surrounded by memories of Tommy. Every room, every object holds a story, a moment we shared with him. And you wanted to throw a party here, as if none of that mattered." Sarah picked up where I left off, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "We're not ready to celebrate. We may never be ready to celebrate in the same way again. Tommy was our world, and now he's gone. We need time and space to grieve, to figure out who we are without him." My mother wiped her eyes, nodding slowly. We thought we were helping. We didn't want you to be alone in your grief." "But we are alone," I said, the words coming out more harshly than I intended. "No one else can truly understand what we're going through. And trying to force us to move on or get back to normal only makes it worse." My father, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "We failed you, son. We were so focused on trying to fix things, on trying to make the pain go away, that we didn't stop to really listen to what you needed." Kate nodded, her face etched with regret. "I'm so sorry, John." Sarah. I thought if I could just get everyone together, it would somehow make things better. I didn't stop to think about how it would affect you. As I looked at their faces, seeing the genuine remorse and understanding dawning in their eyes, I felt some of the anger that had been driving me start to dissipate. In its place, a profound weariness settled over me. "We don't need grand gestures or forced celebrations," Sarah said softly. "We just need your support and understanding. We need you to be patient with us as we navigate this new, awful reality." There was a moment of silence as her words sank in. Then, one by one, they nodded. "We understand now," my mother said, reaching out to take Sarah's hand. "We'll do better, I promise." As the evening wore on, we talked, really talked, for the first time since Tommy's funeral. We shared memories of him, laughed at some of his antics, and cried together over the future he'd never have. It was painful, but it was also cathartic in a way I hadn't expected. When they finally left, the house felt different. Not healed. I doubted it would ever fully heal, but somehow lighter. The weight of misunderstanding and unspoken resentment had lifted, replaced by a fragile but genuine connection. Sarah and I stood in the doorway, watching as their cars disappeared down the street. "Do you think they really understand now?" she asked, leaning into me. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, considering the question. "I think they're starting to. It's a beginning, at least." As we turned back into the house, I caught sight of one of Tommy's photos on the wall. His smile, frozen in time, seemed to hold a different meaning now. It wasn't just a reminder of what we'd lost, but also of the love that still connected us all. That night, as we lay in bed, Sarah turned to me. "John," she said softly, "what you did today, it was risky. It could have backfired badly. I nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. I know, but it felt like the only way to make them truly see. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I think Tommy would have approved. He always did have a flair for the dramatic. The comment startled a laugh out of me, the sound strange and almost foreign after so long. Yeah, he did, didn't he? As we drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking about the future. The road ahead was still long and difficult, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. We weren't alone in our grief anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to help us find our way forward. The plan had unfolded, not quite as I'd expected, but perhaps in the way we'd needed most. It wasn't about revenge in the end, but about understanding. And in that understanding, we'd found a path to healing, slow and painful, but healing nonetheless. The days following the failed party were filled with a strange mix of tension and relief. The house, once a battleground of emotions, now felt like neutral territory. Sarah and I moved through our daily routines, still grieving but no longer burdened by the weight of misunderstanding that had plagued us before. It was about a week after the incident when Kate called. I stared at her name on my phone screen, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to maintain the fragile peace we'd achieved. But I knew we couldn't avoid this conversation forever. Hello? I answered, my voice cautious. John, Kate's voice came through, subdued and hesitant. How are you? How's Sarah? We're managing, I replied, surprised by the honesty in my own words. It's still hard, but we're taking it day by day. There was a pause, and I could almost hear Kate gathering her courage. Listen, John, I've been doing a lot of thinking since the party. I owe you and Sarah a massive apology. I sank into the armchair, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Kate, no, please, she interrupted. Let me say this. I was so wrapped up in trying to fix things, in trying to make everything better, that I completely disregarded your feelings. I didn't stop to think about what you and Sarah really needed. I was selfish and insensitive, and I'm truly, deeply sorry. Her words hung in the air, and I found myself at a loss for how to respond. The anger that had fueled my actions had largely dissipated, leaving behind a complex tangle of emotions. Thank you, Kate, I finally said. That means a lot. I've been talking to Mom and Dad, she continued. We all feel terrible about how we've handled things. We want to make it right, if you'll let us. I thought about Sarah, about the long nights we'd spent talking after the failed party, about how we'd agreed that while the execution might have been extreme, the result, our family finally understanding our need for space and time. To grieve was what we'd needed all along. I appreciate that, Kate, I said. But you have to understand, this isn't something that can be fixed overnight. We're still grieving. We're still trying to figure out how to live in a world without Tommy. I know, she said softly. And we don't expect things to go back to normal. We want to be there for you, in whatever way you need us to be. As we talked, I felt something shift inside me. The desire for revenge, the need to make them understand through drastic measures, had faded. In its place was a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward together. After hanging up with Kate, I found Sarah in Tommy's room. She was sitting on his bed, holding one of his old stuffed animals. She looked up as I entered, a question in her eyes. That was Kate, I said, sitting down beside her. She wanted to apologize. Said they all did. Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the worn fur of the stuffed bear. Do you think they really understand now? I thought about Kate's words, about the genuine remorse in her voice. I think they're starting to. It's a process, just like our grief. We sat in silence for a while, surrounded by Tommy's things. Each object held a memory, a piece of the life we'd shared with our son. But for the first time since his death, those memories didn't feel like a weight threatening to crush us. They were bittersweet, yes, but also a comfort. You know, Sarah said after a while, what you did, with the house, the party, it was pretty incredible. I looked at her, surprised. You're not mad about it? She shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Mad? No. It was extreme, sure, But it worked. They finally saw what we've been trying to tell them all along. I nodded, feeling a mix of pride and lingering guilt. I just couldn't stand the thought of them coming here, celebrating as if nothing had changed. I know, Sarah said, leaning her head on my shoulder. And in a way, I think Tommy would have approved. He always did have a flair for the dramatic. The comment startled a laugh out of me, the sound strange and almost foreign in the quiet room. Yeah, he did, didn't he? As the days passed, we began to see small changes in how our family interacted with us. Instead of pushing for normalcy or trying to distract us from our grief, they started to simply be present. My parents would drop by with groceries, not staying long, but making sure we knew they were there if we needed them. Kate would send texts, not to make plans or push for gatherings, but just to check in, to let us know she was thinking of us. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, times when well-meaning words hit a raw nerve. But there was also a new understanding, a recognition that our grief was not something to be fixed or rushed, but something to be respected and supported. About a month after the failed party, we decided to have a small gathering at our house. Not a celebration, but a memorial of sorts. We invited only our immediate family, my parents, Kate, and Sarah's brother. As they arrived, I could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the memory of the last time they'd been here still fresh. But this time was different. We'd set up a small table in the living room with photos of Tommy and some of his favorite things. There were no forced smiles, no attempts at false cheer. Instead, we sat together, sharing memories of Tommy, laughing at some of his antics, and yes, crying together over the future he'd never have. As the evening wore on, I found myself in the kitchen with my father. He was helping me clean up, a comfortable silence between us as we worked. "You know, son," he said after a while, his voice gruff with emotion, "I'm proud of you. Both of you. The way you've handled all of this, it's been incredibly brave." I looked at him, surprised by the unexpected praise. "Thanks, Dad. It hasn't been easy." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know. And I'm sorry we made it harder at first. We didn't know how to help. We still don't, really. But we're learning." As we rejoined the others in the living room, I looked around at our small family gathering. It wasn't the joyous celebration Kate had originally envisioned, but it felt right. It felt like a step forward, a way of honoring Tommy's memory while acknowledging the reality of our loss. Later that night, after everyone had left, Sarah and I stood in the quiet house. The remnants of our gathering, dirty dishes, half-empty glasses, surrounded us, but for once, the mess didn't feel oppressive. It felt like life, messy and imperfect, but moving forward. "Do you think this is what healing looks like?" Sarah asked, leaning into me. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, considering the question. "I don't know if we ever fully heal from something like this. But maybe this is what learning to live with it looks like." As we cleaned up, I thought about the journey we'd been on. The grief, the anger, the desperate need to make others understand. The plan I'd concocted, born out of pain and frustration, had unfolded in ways I never could have predicted. What had started as an act of revenge had become a catalyst for change, for understanding. The execution of my plan hadn't been perfect. It had been risky, potentially damaging. But in the end, it had achieved something I hadn't even realized we needed, a bridge between our grief and the world around us. It had forced our family to confront the reality of our loss, to see beyond their own discomfort and truly empathize with our pain. As we got ready for bed that night, I caught sight of one of Tommy's photos on the nightstand. His smile, frozen in time, seemed different now. It wasn't just a reminder of what we'd lost, but also of the love that still connected us all, to him and to each other. The path ahead was still long and difficult. There would be good days and bad days, moments of progress and setbacks. But for the first time since we'd lost Tommy, I felt like we weren't walking that path alone. Our family, shaken out of their complacency by my drastic actions, were now truly there for us, ready to support us in whatever way we needed. The revenge I'd sought had transformed into something else entirely, a painful but necessary step towards understanding, towards healing. It wasn't the end of our journey, far from it. But it was a beginning, a first tentative step towards finding our way in this new, altered world. As Sarah and I drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking of Tommy. In my mind's eye, I could almost see him nodding in approval, that mischievous glint in his eye that I missed so much. And for the first time in a long while, the memory brought more comfort than pain. The execution of revenge had not gone as planned, but perhaps it had gone exactly as it needed to. As the seasons changed, so did our lives. The sharp edges of grief began to soften, not disappearing entirely, but becoming something we could carry with us rather than something that threatened to crush us at every turn. The aftermath of my drastic actions at the failed party continued to ripple through our family dynamics, reshaping our relationships in ways I never could have anticipated. It was a crisp autumn morning when I found myself sitting on the back porch, a cup of coffee warming my hands as I watched the leaves fall from the old oak tree in our yard. Tommy used to love climbing that tree, his laughter echoing through the air as he swung from branch to branch. The memory brought a smile to my face, bittersweet, but no longer accompanied by that sharp stab of pain that had once been ever present. Sarah joined me, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she settled into the chair beside me. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet morning air. I turned to look at her, taking in the subtle changes in her face. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and there was a peacefulness in her expression that had been absent for so long. "Just thinking about how much has changed," I replied. "How much we've changed?" She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?" "That's an understatement," I chuckled, the sound no longer feeling foreign or wrong. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee and watching the world wake up around us. It was moments like these that made me realize how far we'd come. The oppressive weight of grief that had once filled every corner of our lives had eased, allowing moments of peace, even joy, to slip through. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "What you did at the party, I mean." I considered her question carefully. The events of that day had been a turning point for us, but they had also been risky, potentially damaging. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. It wasn't perfect, and maybe there were better ways to handle it, but it got us here. It made them understand in a way that words alone couldn't." Sarah reached out, taking my hand in hers. "I think you're right. It was extreme, but it was what we needed. What they needed, too, even if they didn't know it at the time." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with a text from Kate. "Thinking of you guys today. How about dinner next week? No pressure, just if you're up for it." I showed the message to Sarah, who smiled softly. "It's nice, isn't it? How they check in now without pushing." I nodded, typing out a quick reply. The change in our family's approach had been one of the most significant outcomes of that day. Gone were the forced attempts at cheer, the pushing for us to move on or get back to normal. Instead, they had learned to be present with us in our grief, to acknowledge it rather than try to fix it. Our relationship with my parents had undergone a similar transformation. They had been deeply shaken by the events of the party, forced to confront the depth of our pain in a way they hadn't before. In the months that followed, they had become a quiet, steady presence in our lives. They would drop by with groceries or to help with yard work, not staying long, but always making sure we knew they were there if we needed them. Even our wider circle of friends had been affected. Word had spread about what had happened at the party, and while some had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the raw emotion of it all, others had drawn closer. They had learned to sit with us in our grief, to mention Tommy's name without fear, to share memories of him that made us laugh and cry in equal measure. As the morning wore on, Sarah and I found ourselves reminiscing about Tommy. We talked about his first day of school, his love for science experiments that often ended in disaster, the way his face would light up when he talked about his dreams for the future. For the first time, we were able to share these memories without feeling like we were drowning in sorrow. "You know," Sarah said, a thoughtful look on her face, "I think Tommy would be proud of us. Of how we've handled all of this." I felt a lump form in my throat at her words. "You think so?" She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He always did have a flair for the dramatic. I think he would have appreciated your grand gesture." I couldn't help but laugh at that, the sound mingling with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Yeah, he probably would have. He'd probably be asking for all the technical details of how I pulled it off. As the day progressed, I found myself reflecting on the journey we'd been on. The loss of Tommy had shattered our world, leaving us struggling to find our footing in this new, altered reality. My actions at the party, born out of desperation and a need to make others understand, had been a turning point. It hadn't been an easy road. There had been setbacks, moments when the grief threatened to overwhelm us again. But slowly, surely, we had begun to heal. Not in the sense of getting over our loss. I knew now that we would never truly get over losing Tommy. But we had learned to live with it, to carry our love for him with us as we moved forward. That evening, as Sarah and I prepared dinner together, I was struck by how normal it felt. There was a time when such everyday tasks had seemed impossible, when the weight of our grief had made even the simplest actions feel like monumental efforts. Now, while the pain was still there, it no longer defined every moment of our lives. We were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was my parents, stopping by on their way home from a doctor's appointment. As we invited them in, offering them a cup of coffee, I was struck by the ease of the interaction. There was no awkwardness, no forced cheerfulness, just a quiet understanding. As we sat around the kitchen table, the conversation flowed naturally. We talked about everyday things: Dad's garden, Mom's book club, the latest gossip from the neighborhood. But we also talked about Tommy, sharing memories and laughing at some of his more outrageous antics. At one point, Mom reached out and took my hand. "We're so proud of you both," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The way you've handled everything, it's been incredible." I felt a lump form in my throat, overcome by the simplicity and sincerity of her words. "Thanks, Mom," I managed to say. "We couldn't have done it without your support." As they were leaving, Dad pulled me aside. "Son," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I know I don't say it often enough, but I love you. And I'm sorry for not understanding sooner. What you did, it opened our eyes, made us see what we'd been blind to." I hugged him tightly, feeling the strength in his embrace. "I love you too, Dad," I said. "And it's okay. We're all learning together." That night, as Sarah and I got ready for bed, I found myself standing in front of the photo wall in our hallway. It was filled with pictures of Tommy, from his first steps to his high school graduation. But now, mixed in with those memories, were newer photos. Photos of us with family and friends, smiling and living, carrying Tommy's memory with us. Sarah came up beside me, wrapping her arm around my waist. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I turned to her, taking in the face of the woman who had been my rock through all of this. "I'm thinking about how far we've come," I said. "About how much has changed and how much has stayed the same." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It's not the life we planned," she said softly. "But it's ours. And Tommy is still a part of it, even if it's not in the way we wanted." As we climbed into bed, I thought about the journey we'd been on. The loss, the grief, the desperate act that had changed everything. It hadn't been easy, and there were still difficult days ahead. But we had found a way forward, a way to honor Tommy's memory while still living our lives. The revenge I had sought had transformed into something else entirely, a catalyst for change, for understanding, for growth. It wasn't the end I had envisioned when I first conceived my plan, but perhaps it was the end we had needed all along. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking of Tommy. In my mind's eye, I could see him smiling, that mischievous glint in his eye that I missed so much. And for the first time in a long while, the image brought more comfort than pain. We had survived the unthinkable. We had found a way to live with our grief, to carry it with us without letting it consume us. And in doing so, we had discovered a strength we never knew we possessed. The aftermath of my actions had reshaped our world in ways I never could have predicted. But as I lay there, Sarah's steady breathing beside me, I realized that we had emerged stronger, more compassionate, more connected. It wasn't the happy ending we had once dreamed of, but it was ours. And somehow, that was enough.